Alrighty, so week 9 learn together. I'm gonna I don't want to say this to psych you out, but I also want to help you understand that this week we're gonna take a pretty major step forward in our ability to use JavaScript to create some meaningful user interfaces. Okay. And what we're gonna do is basically take your week 7 stimulus, bring it into a new folder, week 9, and we're going to implement some user input. So because there are 3 variables, right? There is the filing status, adjusted income, and the number of children. Those are 3 inputs that I want you to create. And I would say I model this, not model this, but when I approach this, I looked at it more similar to the to-do app that Andrew showed than the notes app. So what you're going to do is create those 3 fields, write the code, right? That first make sure does some validation. You know what I've talked about with minimal validation. I'll show you mine in a minute, right? And that implements by getting those 3 pieces of information from the user and then calculates stimulus and renders that stimulus back on the page. Okay, so that's kind of, right, I would say step 1 and step 2. And I did this yesterday and it took me just a little bit because honestly, I had to go back. I hadn't been quite tracking with all the content from Andrew. And it was like, oh, yes, this is how you do that, right? Oh, yeah, this is how he handles it. Now, I went off meaning I didn't quite follow the way he did it, but that's okay too. You can, everything you're about to do, you've seen done, and some you've already done. Okay, so there's 4 total steps you have over the next 2 weeks to do them. I definitely at minimum want you to do step 1 and step 2 and start working on step 3 and 4, which is to, once you get the stimulus inputs, to then generate back to the screen, right? So in other words, you get the input, you calculate the stimulus, you give them some kind of output. That you're in a good space. I would start looking at the things we're learning now, which is local storage. How to then, once you get user input, is to store that in local storage. And then instead of using just the immediate user impact or the input, you'll actually, when you get the input, you'll store it in local storage and then you'll render what is in local storage back. Now, this is why I'm spreading it over 2 weeks, okay? So the other part of this is using a UUID. Now, in my particular code, and let me just say this, hopefully you, now this is going to be due after your code along, and in the code along, he'll talk about and show you how to implement UUID. But I will just tell you, and I'll probably mention this in the attendance, so hopefully students watch this, is that the links that he provides to using so you're using somebody else's code, I recommend just bringing into your own system and using it, and I'll show you how I did that. But I just want you to know that. So, but let's just talk about what are we using UUID for? It's a code. It's code that we use to run a function, somebody else's function, that generates a unique identifier. And we do that so that starting, and I'll probably have added a little more to this by week 10, that you will not only present what's in local storage, render it to the DOM, but you can also then have some things to where you can target those individual, in this case, I'd call them records, so that you can present them on another page or maybe delete them. So there's a lot we can do once we can target them, okay? So this is the, right, and again, I'll show you mine. So that's the first part. And I'll just say it again, at minimum, step 1 and 2, I definitely recommend working on the rest. So part of what I think it's a good time to do is to talk about Dev 1. I looked at the calendar. The good news is right before break. So if we look at the timeline, right? So if you're coming to see me for a code review, before the due date, you be coming the week before the actual. Actually, let's go look. Now that I've said that, I'm like, let me go look. Because I thought I had this right in my head, but as soon as I started talking about it, I'm like, maybe I don't, right? So right here. Okay, so actually it's not due until after spring break. Okay, so if I roll forward, meaning you could definitely, and I would recommend you work on it before. So if you wanted to talk to me before, but spring break is your opportunity, of course, because you'll have that extra week. So really your Dev 1 will be due after spring break. So that week coming back from break will be the week that, as we saw this time, you can see me before the due date. Okay. So getting back to Dev 1. So here's my draft of down here on the bottom. And the second part of what I want you to do for this Learn Together is I want you to consider what your Dev 1, what are you going to do for it, right? So you can see, and maybe what I'll do is start with this, like for the reply, 20 points here, what are the inputs you will get from the user, right? How will you handle the user interface? What will you store into local storage? What data will you allow the user to edit? That'll be one of the things. And maybe we'll talk about that as you see this happen in the coming weeks. And what other JS functionality will you implement, or your thoughts or questions? So if you scroll down, and by the way, I categorize this in a way that is talked about in industry. Really what you're doing is Crud Operations, which is why I have that on there. So what are they? Create data. So when you get the user interface, right, you grab those values when the user hits submit, you create that data, right? You read that data back. That's what rendering back is. You update the data and you delete. Now the last two are more of what we will do starting a little next week, but you will see in the way he handles it as far as the to-do app and the note app. But this idea is a very common thing in development that you hear a lot once you move out into the more professional realms, but you may hear it in college as well. So the requirements are listed here. What you can do is look over them, given what we're doing, but it's basically get user from the input, store associated dates and the UUID, right? Give the user the ability to edit, process the data and present it back, implement at least 2 JavaScript code that is not covered in this course. So this is where I want you to venture out. Okay, you are going to need to do some styles. Now we did some of that in week 8, and I know many of you, not actually most of you did okay, but I know CSS, if you haven't had any CSS exposure or training, right, it's also there. And if you should reach out to me, I can give you some good resources here. And the last piece is the dev tools, which I'm keeping in there. Okay, so let me show you my output from this week. So the one thing, so right now, and this is a term I want you to also understand, is the data, once we do it in this way, by storing it in local storage, is persistent. Now, what do I mean by persistent? So I mean this, if I hit right now I have one, right, item of somebody entering my form, and this is the results, right? Now, so when they do married and they give their adjusted income and the number of kids, right? The first part, when you were doing step 1 and 2, the data doesn't persist because you're not using the local storage. And here's what you can just kind of know is if you hit refresh after you've done step 1 and 2, your data will not render into the DOM because it will only remember what was entered in that session. Okay. Now, what you're going to see is this idea of application. And here is what local storage looks like, right? Now, this is before I did the UUID because I did that. But anyway, so I'm going to get rid of that. And now when I refresh, there's no data in there. And the reason there's no data is that I deleted it from here, okay, because I'm using local storage. So if I go head of household or single, adjusted income, number of kids, and I hit submit here, right? Then the result of that input, running the stimulus, figuring out the check amount, and also storing it in local storage is making that data persist, meaning even if I close the browser, it is going to exist in local storage. I'm just going to do this. It's going to exist in here because it is storing inside of the computer into local storage. So again, that's why I'm saying step 1 of this, get 1 and 2 done before you start looking at 3 and 4. Don't do them. Don't try to do them at the same time. It'll just create headaches, right? And again, we have examples for how to do all of this. Doing some level of data validation would be, of course, required here. And the thing I want you to know is this idea of using local storage as we are is really more like we're doing it because we don't want to cover the full database platform. There are other classes that do that. And really for real world applications, we probably wouldn't be using local storage in the way that we're using it here, but it's perfectly fine in the context of which we are learning. Okay. And it gives us so many of those real world CRUD operations. So I just want you to know that I did provide an article here, 2 article about local storage. Okay. And just to kind of help you understand that. Now, how do you approach this? Well, you can look at, you can look at the to-do app. Totally nothing wrong with that. What I would say to you is also challenge yourself to see how much of this, based on the sooner you do this from the time you've watched the lectures, the easier this gets, right? Not the easier, but the more access you have to those concepts, right? Here's what I would tell you, try not to do. Don't just copy over the to-do app and try to modify it for this environment. Notice I didn't put a search on here, right? So there were some things I didn't include from the to-do app, but I built it really for my concept of how to implement stimulus. And why this is so important is doing this is another example of helping you gain these concepts so you can prepare and have a better idea of what your Dev 1 code needs to do. Okay, I didn't go over my code in this example more in detail. And if you want me to, totally let me know. I'd be totally happy in my reply to do more of a technical look at that code. If that's something that you feel would be handy. I, again, did something a little different, but pretty much similar to the coding practices that was done in the To-Do app. 2 parts to this week. Getting back to the stimulus and implementing it minimum 1, 2, work on 3, 4. On next week, we'll do 3, we'll conclude, and I'll add a little edit in there because by that time you will have gotten that part of the course where you actually not only render that information that was captured into the DOM, but you can also give the user the ability to edit it. Okay. Peace out. Have a great one. Talk to you later.